is not presenting with me. It just gets a little bit difficult to have two presenters when the topic is fairly straightforward. So the content is a mixture of what he put in and what I have put in. But in any case, I have it in front of me. Please pay note to my vocal additions to this, because there's quite a lot to be said, but it always is tricky to capture it on the presentation. So now, okay, remember we're looking at the development of your master's and the doctoral thesis. Of course, these things differ, and they differ a little bit or substantially, but in terms of the explanation, they differ a little bit, and I will differentiate that for you. Now, of course, the very obvious learning outcome of this is that by the completion of this session, you should be very clear about the structure and the individual chapter expectations for each of the chapters that are contained in either your master's work or your doctoral work. Of course, talking about these, offering you the guidelines on the structures has some guidance on three specific things. There are things that they call the preliminaries, which are all the things that you do before you enter into the dissertation or thesis proper. And then there's actually the main body or the text, the actual chapters themselves. And of course, at the end, there are the references and how you deal with issues to do with appendices. Now, I will begin with the preliminaries, and these folks are necessary. But as I say, I give you a ballpark description of what they are. What you need to do for your specific space is that before you submit your master's, before you submit your mini dissertation, your thesis, whatever it is, you must make sure that you go to your departmental website and you download their master's and doctoral procedures. There's each of them will have a procedures document that tells you, and that tells you the size of the font you should use. It tells you the spacing that the department indicates. It tells you the referencing, which one would assume you already know by the time you're writing the final piece of work. But you need that document. Do not ever submit without it, because it usually has very fine detail. Sometimes it asks that a person puts a declaration, and the declaration that they themselves wrote, whatever it is they have, and so forth and so forth. And if you miss that declaration, you disqualify yourself in the entirety of your work. So downloading that master's and doctoral thing is critical. And those of you who do not have it yet, you must identify, source it, and if you can, actually develop your original work with that structure and the guidance and the procedures already in mind. So you are developing things that are fit for purpose, rather than writing out everything, then trying to correct it thereafter. So generally, the preliminaries look like this. You will, of course, have your dissertation or thesis title, which, as I have already spoken to, I think I was speaking to the group earlier this week about the fact that the title can be formulated in a number of ways. And some of the ways involve you ensuring that you capture the methodology used, you capture the primary participant or subject that provided your data, the primary question that you were interested in, and of course the primary dependent variable that you are interested in. So, but I think by now, when I speak to this, those of you who are attending this session would already have titles. So there's no need to develop it further. Then, of course, you do acknowledgements. There are basic conventions people follow. You write your acknowledgements in the first person. So you thank whoever. Many people tend to have a lot of people they want to thank, but I think you want to limit that to a single page. It's always a good taste to mention your supervisor. It's not a requirement, but it's just a kind of one way of priming the researcher into realizing that you didn't do this, the examiner into realizing that this journey was not one that you did on your own. So you have the support of a qualified somebody who walked you through it. And you'll be surprised that that kind of always buys you some positive initial assessment points. The abstract, which I will talk to you about, and in fact, one of the preliminaries that you have is an abstract. I've spoken to you many a time about that abstract. Basically, an abstract is normally 300 words, 100 or 150 words, or sometimes 250 words. You need to determine that for your specific department. And the abstract basically has a number of components to it. It has a background, the aim of the study, the methodologies that were used within the study, the primary findings of the study, and what contribution those findings make to practice. So the implications for practice. So I'll go again: background, aim, methodology, results, implications for practice. 5 specific things. Of those things, I've explained to you how each of them are spoken to. I think the presentation I did around proposals really stipulated how you give a summary of your study. But for the purposes of refresher, the background part of your abstract gives a background to the problem. So if you're studying something to do with power failures, for example, then the background would be maybe something that identifies that South Africa is affected this way with power failures, and this is the size of the problem, and up to this point we still do not have a solution for it. That would be the background. Then you would now say, so the background is an overview of the context from which the problem you are talking about has come from. What is the umbrella problem that affects the thing that you are interested in? The aim, of course, becomes the aim of the study that you have already negotiated and have. The methodology is a summary of you saying, this is the design that I use. These are the participants that I collected data from. These are the methods that I use to collect data. Finish. Then the results, what you do is you find 3 or 4 standout findings from your study. So if you found that, if you found something that was unexpected, quite seminal, unique, or so forth, you mention it very quickly there. Then implications for practice relates to how those findings that you have are now going to change the future as it relates to your subject field that you are interested in. You follow the abstract with a table of contents. Folks, I hope that there are none of you who are still generating your table of contents manually. You need to make sure that you figure out on your laptop how to develop a table of contents. So at the end, it's generated automatically by your laptop. If you don't know how to do this, you just go online and you Google up. You just go and Google. You go to YouTube and you look for how to set up a table of contents. Then it'll explain to you. The reason you want to have an automated responsive table of contents is that every time you move things around in your dissertation or thesis, that can automatically update itself. Then, of course, you have the list of figures that will follow the table of contents, and this is really all the graphs, the images, the illustrations that you use. Then also under preliminaries, you have list of tables, list of abbreviations, and glossary or definition of terms that you think are critical for the reader to be aware of, because you'll be utilizing them throughout your study. The latter part The glossary and definition of terms is something that you will navigate yourself and decide whether it's necessary for your study. Some people will believe that they have far too few of these abbreviations that it's better to not do a glossary. They will just deal with these issues within the actual text of their work. Now, I want you to just have a very quick comparative snapshot. And this is where usually the differences are spelled out between different levels of work. I've had this question posed to me a number of times, and I believe that this slide attends to it. So you will remember that at master's level, master's qualifications they aren't all the same. So there are some people who have a master's degree where from the word go, everything that they're doing is going to be about their dissertation. So they don't have modules to study, they are just focusing exclusively on this project. That is typically called a full master's, full research master's. Then, of course, some people will do a master's qualification where maybe there are 4 or 5 modules that are taught. And then the last module is a research module, and it asks them to do a dissertation. That type of dissertation it's called a mini dissertation, because it's not the full dissertation, because the full dissertation would have necessitated a full 2-year study or something. Then there's something that people call a dissertation of limited scope. And a dissertation of limited scope is also similar to a mini dissertation in many ways, in that it normally would have come from a course of study where the individual has got work that is part of modules and so forth. So, and then of course, but the full master's dissertation that we're talking about it has many hallmarks that are very similar to a doctoral thesis. So you will notice that I have done a comparative snapshot overview, and that comparative snapshot overview has 2 columns in it. The first column relates to how the chapters of a dissertation of limited scope, a mini dissertation, sometimes they call it a research project, or a course-based mini dissertation would look like. Basically, any dissertation that has come from a course where the people had to attend other courses, other modules, and this is a small module that just tops up the other modules. Then they would have a mini dissertation, stroke limited scope, or course-based master's dissertation. So the course-based master's dissertation typically has 5 chapters, and I say typically because it's typical. It's not defined as exclusively that. The first chapter is always the background and overview of the study. The second chapter is generally the literature review. So you will notice that a full master's, research master's, and a doctoral thesis have the exact same chapter setups. Of course, the depth, the length, all those things change with each. Then when it comes to chapter 3, in the mini dissertation option, chapter 3 is the methodology chapter, where you give a broad overview of the methodologies that were used, the data collection approaches that were used, and so forth and so forth. Then chapter 4 presents your research and your findings. Then the final chapter allows you to discuss and do conclusions as they relate to your study area. Now, in a full research master's, and this is a master's where all you've done from registration was to prepare for this project. That full master's has the same appearance as a doctoral thesis, just shorter things, less involved engagement, but about the same. And that full master's starts with the first chapter being the background and overview, chapter 2, the literature review, chapter 3, changes now. It's the theoretical and conceptual framework of the study. Now, in A literature review basically looks at all the research that's about and has been contested and so forth, and writes from different spaces about the arguments, the predominant findings in relation to particular things, and so forth and so forth and so forth. But the theoretical and conceptual framing of the study, that differs, because that's the point at which you find existing theories, not research, theories that have been offered to try and explain some of the concepts that you're interested in. And you join those theories up together to come up with this conceptual framework, and you write about all that. Of course, that process of differentiating theoretical and conceptual frameworks and moving from one to the next, I have already taught you this in one of the sessions, but it belongs in chapter 3. Chapter 4, in the full thesis version, is the methodology. Chapter 5 are the results and your findings and the interpretations that you have of these. Chapter 6 is where you take all these findings and you join them up with the other literature, and you start to develop emerging theory around what it is that you're looking at. And from that theory, you of course make recommendations about what should now be done in relation to this emergent theory that you've got. Then the final chapter, chapter 7, is your discussion and conclusions. So to ensure that I give you a thorough overview, my overview will look more like the full research master's and doctoral thesis overview, and less like the one for limited scope. But those who are doing limited scope versions of this, just know that you're going to have shorter chapters by comparison to the your doctoral and full master's equivalent. You're going to have a literature review chapter that involves both existing research and theory. So the literature review chapter essentially becomes the combination of literature review and theoretical and conceptual frameworks, is what you do in your literature review for mini dissertation. The methodology is the same across both pathways, but just bigger with the doctorates. The results and findings are the same too. Then chapter 6, this is where in a research proposal, in a full doctoral thesis or a full research master's, an individual would then have the opportunity to take all their findings, use them to now come up with a theoretical summary of their work, and that theoretical summary is often presented or submitted as a framework, a pictorial framework, and that is exactly how it would look like. And then of course you engage with it by summarizing it, detailing certain things, critiquing it, and so forth. And I'll walk you through all those elements. Then the final chapter, of course, relates to you discussing your study, discussing elements of it, discussing what it is that it's done that's different, what is the new contribution it's made, and so forth and so forth. Now, in broad terms, the introduction, background, and overview is the same across master's and doctoral work, and it serves the same function. It just is much more complicated at the doctoral level because the case that one is making is expected to be more deeply communicated. You're meant to cite more references. You're meant to be more authoritative in your summation. You're also meant to have much more contribution of your own voice within the work, your own voice, so we see much more explicitly what your opinion and positions are in relation to very specific things. So in that introduction, you of course are basically using the introduction and the background and overview to problematize. Firstly, the introduction serves as a way of painting out the picture, a picture of the problem that you're interested in. That picture can be painted in a number of ways. And I've spoken to you at some point about problem magnifiers. That when you're magnifying this picture, you do so by citing certain things. You do so by showing that the problem is significant, it's important. So you give us a taste of the numbers that show this thing that you're interested in is huge, cannot be overlooked. You do so by showing its topical relevance, the fact that it is something that concerns your field currently and remains a priority in whatever shape. You also demonstrate, if you can, the fact that it's been a problem for many years and it remains unresolved. So you show that through demonstrating the relevance. Then, of course, some of you may have topics where the numbers don't support all this, but the nature and challenge of what it is you're looking at is such that it is so serious a problem that it deserves to be studied. So that's the first part. Then, in addition to problematizing and giving a context to your story, you start to drive the reader towards the very specific thing that you're interested in relation to this bigger problem. So someone may say, look, they're interested in power failures. And I'm taking the XCOM example of today as a point of inspiration. But within that, you might be interested in the role played by poor governance. So then what you then do is, of course, your topic starts off by explaining the range of challenges that exist with power provision in South Africa and so forth and so forth. But then you home in as you go towards the end on issues to do with provision and how there are failings around that. Of course, the introduction and background and overview serve a very, very specific purpose. And that specific purpose is to provide a roadmap, to give a roadmap, to give a sense of what it is that how you were drawn into this topic by understanding its size, by understanding so and so, the questions that remain unanswered. Then, of course, you give some sense of the literature that is out there and what people have said so far about particular things. So you are able to state, to give us insights into seminal literature, like the literature that's really the backbone of what you're looking at. You're able to give us the most current state of the science content. You're able to also identify the agreements that exist between different contributors to the understanding of the problem. You can also articulate the context. Who is it that's fighting who and in what way, and what are the basis for disagreement? And then, of course, in the context of that, you're able to also demonstrate the gaps in the knowledge. So now, all this that you do in relation to existing research is very brief because it's in the introduction, and the introduction is literally a baby version of the actual thesis that you do. So in the introduction, you will have a little bit of what looks like a proper literature review, but it will be small, it's a taster, it just picks on big standout contributors. And then once you have done that, you give us an overview of your research objectives or the research questions that you're focusing on. Then towards the end, at the very end of your chapter, people would have given some insights into the methodologies that were used in the study and so forth and so forth. But they end by giving a quick overview of the fact that the whole thesis or dissertation will be structured along 7 chapters or 5 chapters, and these are the chapters, and this is what they stand for. So you must introduce that information. And folks, I will say this once now, but it is a message that I want you to carry all along this presentation. And that message is the fact that it's all good and proper to listen to the sessions that I offer, to really take notes and all that, but the ultimate test of what your own dissertation or thesis will look like is best informed by you finding a few of these completed examples and looking at them and seeing how they differ from you. What is it they've got missing? What could you add? So forth, so forth, so forth. But chapter 1 is really about an overview. And simply put, the introduction or that first chapter helps the person who's reading to understand why you chose what you chose, why you think it is important, why you adopted particular methods and approaches, and also it allows, as you reach towards the end of this debative introduction, you get a chance now to show that there is a gap, and that it is this gap in knowledge that interested you and triggered a study whose aim was to do XYZ, and that study has these following objectives. Now, the literature review, regardless of how you think of it, whether it's a mini dissertation or not, a literature review is a product of you surveying the existing research on your topic. It has a very coherent structure and really sets out to present key arguments that relate to your topic. When I taught you about literature review, I mentioned the issue of typologies, that some people may go for a thematic literature review, some go for a narrative one, some might go for a theoretical one, and so forth and so forth. Once you make a decision about which of these typologies fit you, then you are in a position now to develop. You are in a position to develop a kind of structure for your literature review. And basically, what a literature review looks like is that it begins by you identifying the fact that your chapter 2 is going to be a literature review. Then people will follow that usually by giving a definition of what a literature review is. Then once they've given that definition, they make some suggestions about what the purposes of literature reviews are and what the different possible structures are and which of the structure they are going to adopt. And also they then give insights of a data search strategy. So they will give an outline of the strategy that they are going to utilize to search for data. And that strategy tells you about the inclusion criteria that they used, the exclusion criteria, the search terms that they used, how they decided what papers were more valuable than others, and so forth. And then once they've done that, they will then say, look, we now have these papers that we reviewed. When an initial investigation of this paper suggested that they presented and offered theory and findings that fall under 3 or 4 themes. Then you talk about each of the different themes, if that's what you've chosen to do. So, of course, the ultimate goal of this, of a literature review, is that it describes and gives an overview of all the literature that's been done around your topic. It identifies the key messages that reflect what the state of understanding of your topic is. Also talks about the limitations, the strengths of what it is that is currently available as evidence within your field. It looks at the differing positions that each of these things have in relation to each other. So it depicts the arguments and so forth. It summarizes all these arguments and then comes up by saying, this is where everyone agrees. This is where everyone disagrees. This is what is known. This is what is not known. And the idea being that when you get to what it is that remains a gap, one of the gaps that you identify is a gap that is what you have chosen to study. So you utilize that reference to a knowledge gap as a way of positioning your study so that it is clear what it is that we are now being pushed to focus on. Because you've presented all these gaps, but there's a particular gap that you're interested in. And that gap has to be the one that positions your study as the next thing that should be focused on. So remember, there are some other things, some detail that's useful. I've included some other detail here that will help you to better understand the whole purpose that your literature review serves for you. Much of this I've already spoken about, so I won't labor too much on it. Now, chapter 3. Remember, I gave you that framework that tells you what the different chapters are. So those of you who do not have a theoretical chapter, a theoretical framework or conceptual framework chapter, the likelihood is that the material I'm discussing here would have appeared somewhere in your literature review. So basically, people who do mini dissertations or things that only have a chapter 2 but don't have a theoretical and conceptual framework, those things that relate to conceptual and theoretical frameworks can then be integrated into your literature review as types of literature, essentially. So what then happens? What then happens is chapter 3 is a standalone chapter for people with full masters or who are doing a full master's or who are doing a doctorate. And that chapter is basically where you paint for the reader all the theories that you believe have informed your understanding of the key concepts in your study. So if my study is interested in power failures, if it's interested in service shortcomings, if my study is interested in human attributions for faults and so forth, then the theories that I have will be from those spaces. And from my session, I did explain to you when we did the theoretical and conceptual framework session that the number of theories that a particular study will have is dependent or driven by the number of apparent concepts within its thesis statement. So when you have a statement that says, I am interested in this topic, that topic, and how it intermerges with these, those things you've said are the fingers of your interest. Those are concepts. And each concept might have a theory that helps you to understand it. And so if you have 4 concepts, you might discover there are 4 theories you need, and so forth. But a theoretical framework are those concepts that you say made you understand how to view your topic, how to see, how to understand the topic that you're looking at. But because those theories were written in absentia, you were not there when these theories were written, so whoever wrote them for his or her purposes. You now have a new study that combines these things incidentally in a way that they may not have been combined before. And so when you join those theories, theoretical frameworks, and you pick the little things you want from each to say, these are the 3 things I want from theory A, 5 things I want from theory B, 2 things I want from theory C. Those things that were selected and now are together, you can conceptualize them into a framework. And that framework becomes your conceptual framework. So this chapter describes the process of the identification of your theories, what the theories are, their components, how they are useful to you, what parts you picked out, how you join those things. It presents a conceptual framework, which is usually in the form of a diagram with all the concepts you're interested in. Then you acknowledge how you're going to utilize that conceptual framework. And the first use that it has is that it is the basis upon which someone can say, my study is interested in these 20 concepts. If I'm going to collect data, then my data collection instruments must include these 20 concepts. So then you use the conceptual framework as a guiding tool for the development of your data collection instruments. So that is chapter 3. It's a fairly short chapter. It tends to be more descriptive than not in many instances, and I don't normally want to give numbers and pages and so forth, but I would not be shocked if someone came with a chapter 3 that was only 20-30 pages. It wouldn't shock me. It would be quite okay, but I equally would not be shocked if it was 50 pages. All I'm just saying is that it's varied depending on the number of theories that you engage yourself in. And of course, those of you doing mini dissertations or smaller proposals in one shape or form, all this stuff that I've described, you would have buried it in some shape or form in your chapter 2. Much shorter, of course, and so forth. Now, I have put some other detail about theoretical and conceptual frameworks. All of this I've included here, so when you get the presentation, you can use it to jog your memory. But it's all material that I've taught you already, that you have from the previous videos, and it doesn't need to be jumped on again. And of course, this describes or tells you the things that you would do in that chapter, and the very things that I've detailed already about how you describe the frameworks and so forth. And remember, the general position with your dissertation or your thesis is that you're writing about things that have occurred. So the tense that you tend to talk about is the tense of the past, that you use the past tense and not to indicate that I'm writing about something that I've already done. So once again, I've given you a summative statement about what the purpose of theories are, that they are formulated to explain, to predict, and to understand phenomena. And of course, the structure of a theoretical framework allows that. And then, of course, the conceptual framework allows you to take elements from the different theories to fulfill what it is that you want to do. Now, the fourth chapter, so we are on the third chapter, which was the conceptual, the theoretical and conceptual frameworks. Chapter 4 really gives a detailed step-by-step overview of how you went about collecting data. And how people write chapter 4 is very, very dependent on your discipline, on the extent to which the discipline wants detail. And what I strongly suggest to all of you is that you go to previous submitted pieces of work and you look at it. And essentially, the most comprehensive of these methodology chapters will start at the very big end, where they talk about epistemology. And they say, look, this study that I was looking at comes from the constructivist world. Constructivism is this. You compare it to other things and you explain why constructivism was the best approach. Then, of course, once you've chosen constructivism, you would then say, right, the design or the paradigm that I utilized was qualitative, phenomenological, and so forth and so forth. Then you explain those things. They are the things that I spoke to you about, and I said these are principles. One of the principles I spoke about was the principle of rigor. And rigor is about being able to show that you have an understanding of the choice you've made, how that choice came about, and if it involved you looking at other competing alternatives and disqualifying them because they had certain limitations, you engage the reader in some of that within your work. So someone would say, hey, Mine is a qualitative study, qualitative interpretative phenomenology. Then you explain that all the options that were possible were X, Y, Z. These are what the options are characterized by. These are the limitations. And this is how your chosen approach trumps those and is better than those. Once you've chosen the qualitative design, then of course, or the qualitative tradition, then, the qualitative paradigm. Within that paradigm, there are smaller traditions. So you declare that it's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. But within those, in the qualitative world, there are the traditions we spoke about, phenomenology, ethnography, and so forth. In quantitative research, there is the true experiment, there are quasi-experiment, and then there are non-experimental studies, so you would indicate which one of those. In mixed methods research, there's concurrent mixed methods, sequential mixed methods. There are also other ways that you can talk about this, whether there's an embedment where you've embedded one particular one particular paradigm into another, so you can explain it that way. But there is a need for you to go beyond just saying it was a qualitative study. You have to say what way it was qualitative, why that particular qualitative option and not any other. So remember, the methodology bit is the bit where I speak about the W's that you have to speak about. The where did this happen? So you would give us some insight into the context of where the study was carried out. The when, you speak about the timing of this. Did it occur as a singular thing? Did you do it over a duration of 2 months, 3 months? With whom? Who are the participants? And where did it take place? So you give us insights into your sampling approaches and so forth. Then, of course, remember, you are reporting on a study that was already carried out. So in that term, you give reports on some of the practical occurrences and things that you had to consider. So things like the obstacles faced, your role as a researcher, challenges that you had, ethical considerations that you had to deal with, data collection challenges that occurred, how you manage them, how you've recorded those challenges, how you believe that those challenges affect or have no impact on your results. So take, for example, if you were doing a study and somewhere you had 50 people consent to offer you data, but of those 57 didn't show up, and you discover that all the 7 who didn't come were men, and you were studying something that was sensitive to men, you would then be expected within the methodology section to make reference to that discovery that you had and how you think it changes things. Of course, research methodology in broad terms is a specific procedures or techniques that are used to identify, select, process, and analyze information about a topic. And really, it's quite systematic in the way that you present this. Many of you have already had very thoroughly written proposals that are sitting in front of you. And my suggestion is that you take that proposal and you basically expand the methodology section. So the content that's there is totally appropriate, but it needs to be expanded on to reflect the greater depth, because this is you reporting on something after the fact. So remember now, the methodology chapter was telling us what you did. The data presentation, or rather the findings and results section, is really about you telling us what you found. And there are different ways to do this, and the different ways are guided by the school of thought that you will be following as your predominant way of thinking about this. So quantitative researchers believe that you present the results as you saw them, and then you do the interpretation later. Qualitative researchers say that present the findings And as you present them, do interpretation, do their analysis, and so forth. So clearly, when you're designing this chapter, you'll find that a quantitative the results and findings chapter will be different from a qualitative one by virtue of that difference. Then, of course, mixed method studies may be compelled to have a section that operates in a quantitative way and a section that operates in a qualitative way. And sometimes people will opt to have a chapter that's qualitative and a chapter that's quantitative, but then that also will then raise question about how you integrate the two towards the end. But it is possible. And of course, when you're presenting your findings, remember that it is important to deal with the unwanted monotony. So some people will decide that, right, I love graphs because I've suddenly learned how to create graphs on SPSS or whatever the tool is that you're using. And they present everything in graphs. That monotony needs to be managed. So you give variance, and the variance is around making sure that you choose the best way of succinctly presenting what it is that you need to present. So there'll be times where tables are better. There'll be times where statistical maps are better, pictograms, a pie, linear bar chart, histogram, whatever it is. But you need to vary those things. And of course, there are questions and different approaches to this, but generally, every picture that you provide must be accompanied with an explanation of what is in the picture. So, and many people will say, look, you present the picture, then you explain the picture after you've shown the picture. Some will say, do the explanation and then put the picture after the explanation. But my position, which I hold and I've defended quite a number of times, is the fact that it seems to be more plausible that you put a picture, then the person sees the picture, and once they've got that picture, you proceed to explain that, that chart above reflects the age of the participants, and so 5% were this, 10% were that, but after the picture has been shown already. Now, remember, when you're presenting data, you're not just presenting it for the sake of presenting it. You've got objectives that drove your study. So when you're presenting that, let's say, objectives or questions, and some people will find it much easier to name, to understand what the questions were, and then to present the findings under the specific questions. So if one of your questions was you were interested in the nature and frequency of power cuts occurring, then your first findings that you would show would be all the findings from the different sources that gave you insights into the frequency of power cuts and the nature of those power cuts. So, and so you can present your findings along the lines of saying, I'll present the findings as they relate to the different objectives that I thought were critical to the study. That is usually easier to follow for the reader and lends itself to you making sure that what you promised to understand, you really did understand. Now, there's this whole issue about analysis or interpretation. Look, and the best way to depict this is that someone can take a picture of an orange and place it on a table. And when they place that picture on that table, everyone in the room can look at the same orange, but the only way you will know whether that orange belongs to a doctoral candidate, a master's candidate, or a bachelor's candidate is by what they do with the orange, how they analyze it, how they segmentalize it, how they break it up, how they deal with it as a broken up piece of something. So, and what I'm saying in respect of that is I'm saying to you that if if the data that you have in front of you is not appropriately interpreted, then it does not depict or reflect the level of study that is associated with what it is that you're portraying. So the interpretation is very important. The findings can be the same, but something that's interpreted by a doctoral student will show multi-level engagement with it. They will analyze it, look at it from different positions, then look at all those positions and weigh out that what's the best judged way of seeing all these positions. Then they also offer a new way of thinking about what it is that they just looked at. But a master's student is not expected to offer a new way. They are meant to just do the analysis and at best put together what they think those viewpoints can be amalgamated into. So that is where the big difference now sets itself out, that you can have a study done by a master's level student and the same thing done by a doctoral level student, but the interpretation levels are where it differs. And what I always ask for people is that, look, the interpretation story is not one that is easy to understand. It is something that you develop over the course of time. So you will have to write a number of iterations of this. And beyond that, you should then once again go and look at examples of graduated pieces of work and see how far they took it. And that will give you a sense, hey? That will give you a sense. Right, okay, so I continue to talk about how you can do the interpretation. And really, when you're doing interpretation, remember it's an interplay between 3 or 4 things. So when you're interpreting something or really offering your own voice is you saying, these are what the findings tell me. This is how the findings relate to the concept and theories that I've described so far. This is how these findings relate to the theory, to the literature that I presented to you. And then, of course, how do these things that I've seen possibly become significant and important for future application? So that is literally how, and I think I've done this thing about how you tie up the results. That you tie them up by connecting them to the conceptual and theoretical framework. You tie them up to what the literature was telling you. You tie them up to how you think this contributes to new things. And then, of course, you can draw conclusions and inferences about what your findings mean to the bigger space. Now, of course, in data summarization and the conclusion of your chapter, you have to remember that these are the findings that were trying to answer specific questions that were depicted in your research questions. And so when you summarize, you are summarizing in relation to how what you found helps you to better understand those questions that you had asked. And then, of course, you then acknowledge that, look, these are the standout things that the research shows me. And then once you've got those things, you jump into chapter 6, where you now have the data from the findings, you have the data from the literature review, you have the understanding from the theoretical concepts, your chapters 3, 4, and 5 respectively. You now use those combinations of things to say, right, I know enough from the human beings that I've interviewed. I know enough from the literature that I looked at. I know enough from the theories that drove me. So I'm in a position to now say, I join those things up and I can now theorize, develop a new way of understanding this. And this is where the chapter basically talks about what developing theories is about. the process of developing theories. You confirm how you yourself have thought about this process of developing theories. You propose a theory, whether your theory is in words or in the form of a pictorial framework. Then you actually start to talk about the limitations, the strengths, and the contributions of that theory. And that is literally it. That's so all these other sections that are spoken about and spoken, highlighted here in bullet points, are just that formal process of you saying, look, I now have information from the literature review I did in chapter 2. I have information from the conceptual framework I did in chapter 3. I have information from chapter 5, which gave me the results and findings. I can join those pieces of information to now come up with my new understanding and specification of what I think is going on. And it is at this point where you're now in a position to build this theoretical position or a framework that is made up of all these pieces of information. Then you say, hey, this is a framework. These are the attributes of a good theory as suggested by so-and-so. Here are the strengths of what I've done. Here are what the limitations. Here's what potential application this thing has got. And then, of course, because it is your work, the idea is to really push it as being something that has come from this sound evidential process that you followed. But ultimately, you want to show that even though you propose something, you have the foresight to understand that it should be subjected to inquiry, it should be subjected to review, and so forth. Then, folks, the final chapter is your discussion and your conclusion. And this chapter is where you really just basically give an overview. It's chapter 1 was a roadmap of where you want to go. Chapter 7 is a map of where you have been, basically. So everything else that I talk about is literally you saying, look, this study did this. This is what chapter 1 did. Chapter 2 did this. My findings were this. This is that. Then you also do something very specific. So in a master's level work, you talk about the significance of your work and how it is important to your field. And you stop there. Within the doctorate, you do that, but you also talk about the unique contribution that this thing that you've got has made. And you discuss what the implications of your findings, the implications of your studies is to this thing that you are studying, so that people can understand that your study has changed the world in many ways. It is important and critical that you always admit what it is that you think your study lacks, and you acknowledge it by saying, look, this gives an opportunity for things that can be done later. The conclusion, as is always the case, and I think you all know that, is just a summative acceptance of statements just to solidify and close off. And really the discussion and conclusion is sometimes difficult to differentiate, and you would not be blamed for struggling with that because they are within the same chapter. Then you follow that with the reference list. You get the requirements from that master's and doctoral procedures book that I told you about. Then there are some documents that are useful and would have been referred to in your work, but you don't necessarily include them in the body of your work. And these include things like your ethical clearance letter, samples of your consent letters, the gatekeeper's letter that you used, some of the instruments, examples of the data collection instruments that you used. You can attach a plagiarism report if you have it, or you should have it. And also you are expected to include a certificate confirming editorship. So that is